Hey there gamers, DreamcastGuy here, and it's time to talk about literally my favorite topic in the entire universe, which is the Final Fantasy VII Remake, because this is still such an interesting, curious, and controversial project. It seems like for every new piece of content, whether it is big combat systems or added cutscenes, it feels like people are very divided as to whether or not the remakes are good or bad. Personally, I absolutely loved Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 1, but now they've started to discuss more about Rebirth, the second section of the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy, and some of these new details that they're releasing this morning are a bit weird, so I want to try and dissect them with you guys. Hope you're having a great morning. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a big ol' like and subscribe if you haven't already. So today we're going to be talking about the Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2, which is Rebirth, and additionally the Crisis Core Remaster, because they're starting to really discuss both aspects of this, and I think it's really fleshing out why these games are going to be better, but also very much different. So let's start things off. So what I found is this interesting bullet points. This guy has been translating and dissecting a bunch of the different interviews. They're kind of all over the place. They've been talking to a bunch of different media outlets. They're doing what's called a press tour, where they're sort of just digging into different questions that people have. But what's interesting is that this first bullet point, the story is unchanged, only the order and the scale of events will be different because it's a trilogy. Now, one of the biggest questions I feel like I've seen people discussing when it came to the original Final Fantasy VII Remake is the fact that, well, honestly, the fact that it's called Remake when it's not really a remake. The reason that sort of struck me is because the original game we got now a couple years ago was called Remake, but obviously it completely took place in Midgar. We got extra characters, extra summons, extra magic that should not even exist yet, but here it was in Part 1. And it's starting to make me think, how much further are they going to go with this? How much more are they going to try and expand or compress? The fact that they are specifically saying the story is unchanged, this to me is the biggest interesting thing, because honestly, I do think this might be a lie, or maybe they're going to try and change things around so the events look different but end up the same. Now, what I mean by that is that during the course of playing the Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 1 multiple times now, and of course going back and beating the original Final Fantasy VII like 100 times, I noticed that the pacing of these stories is definitely different. But the fact that we've already seen Sephiroth, the fact that we've already fought Sephiroth, even in the first game, is making me think they're going to have to introduce some bigger extra element, some giant extra twist, extra layers, extra enemies, extra villains to try and turn this from one decently length game into 3 super long games. The original Final Fantasy VII took about 25 hours to beat total, and yet Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 1, just on its own, took about 25 to 30 hours to finish, which means that is this new series going to be 3 times longer? Well, according to this, no. If it's still trying to hit those main story beats, how much extra can you drag out just via side quests and extra cutscenes? Now, here's the next beat. So there was obviously that Rebirth trailer that was released, a couple weeks ago now. I'm still sort of buzzing over it, but in it, the predominant shot is this singular image of Cloud here and Sephiroth walking towards some mysterious mountains. This is now confirmed to be the Calm flashback. If you've not played Final Fantasy VII, there's this very, very famous scene where after they escaped Midgar, Cloud and all of his friends sort of sit down to talk about how the heck it is that Sephiroth is legally declared dead and yet walking around with a big old sword in his hand. And during the course of that flashback, we see Cloud going to the Calm Mountains. So this is interesting because it is showing the fact that they are going to try and do these flashbacks inside the game itself. Now, the reason that strikes me is because, honestly, we ended Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 1 incredibly strong. Like, if you actually max leveled your character in the first game, you're probably a beast. And one of the questions I've had in my mind personally is, are they going to do a level wipe? Are we going to go back to level 1 for Part 2 and then again essentially for Part 3? This, in my mind, sort of confirms that. Assumedly, what if they start off the Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2? What if Rebirth begins with a 3 or 4 hour flashback of the events of COM? That would be extremely cool, and I'm excited about it. But I'm assumedly you're going to be level 1 for that, so it would make sense if you leave that cutscene and you're just going back to like level 10 instead of level 50. To me, this seems like the most obvious course of action because you can't have people just keep getting stronger and stronger each game with rolling over save files. At least, I don't think Square Enix would do that. Now, here's the next one. So after you're done with Rebirth, you will understand everything about Zack. This is a very interesting one because this can mean two things separately. First and foremost, if you played the extra DLC thing they did for Final Fantasy VII Remake, which was called Intermission, at the end of it, you saw that Zack in the current timeline is seemingly alive. Despite the fact that obviously he dies in the prequel, which is Crisis Core, he somehow seems to have a very fast heartbeat. And that doesn't seem possible. It seems to hint as the fact that we're going to get multiple timelines or alternate universe stuff, which I'm still open-minded about, but people seem to be a bit angry. Well, it's interesting that they said this specifically. After you are done with Rebirth, you will understand everything about Zack. Now, I do feel like this is them sort of tipping their hand and saying that if there is going to be multiverses or something, that situation will either be solved or explained by the end of this game. At least that's sort of what I'm taking out of that. I'm curious to see how that plays out. The reason behind the name Rebirth is because it is the same meaning as remake, as it's basically the game, it's basically to give the game a sense of playing something new. So they are just going to be using renames for all three of them. So I'm assuming that the third game is going to be called Remaster or something. Then if each of them is going to have some sort of a refreshed rename, that's interesting. I assumed Rebirth might mean like the rebirth of Sephiroth. I thought it might be that because we're learning about why Sephiroth is alive, why Sephiroth might exist in multiple timelines. I assumed Rebirth was hinting at that, about, is Genova getting stronger? Is this some sort of reconstruction of classic Sephiroth? Now here's the last two slides. One of these is more about the Crisis Core reunion, and this one's still about Rebirth. But this is the one that's sort of interesting to me because it certainly explains that it doesn't sound like the plan for the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy was as set in stone as we previously imagined. Nomura, who obviously was the director of the first game and is now producer of the entire trilogy, said that initially they wanted this project to be a duology, which is just two games, and he wanted it to finish as soon as possible and not stretch it or milk it. Trilogy is the sweet spot. The project will not destroy the image of the original in respect to the fans. Now, both of these are incredibly specific statements that I feel like, again, convey what's actually going on. This sounds like from the very start, they probably have a big checklist of cutscenes and ideas and objectives they're trying to accomplish inside these remakes. The major plot points, arriving at Juno, the weapons awakening, the freaking super weapons just kind of terrorizing the planets, Cloud going to jail for a bit. I think that all of this stuff is stuff they want to put into this game. And it's interesting that they were going to try and do this as two games and now have decided to make it a trilogy, which I hope ends up being a good course. But this additionally, the project will not destroy the image of the original in respect to the fans. Will not destroy the image of the original. Again, this is such a fascinating term to use. It sounds like they're almost promising not to screw it up. And again, going back to that first tweet, they say here, the story is unchanged. I think they're trying to tell people not to worry about weird, big, pointless plot twists. They're not going to make it so that Aerith is alive or that Tifa dies instead or something like that. It seems like they're trying to allude to the fact that this is still pretty heavily on pace to be the same game, even if it has extra details in it. Now, this last one is also one that to me is very interesting. It feels like the Crisis Core reunion hype has been surprisingly big. I'm excited about Crisis Core. I didn't hate the original version already. I feel like I see a lot of hate for Crisis Core because honestly, it was cheesy and bad voice acting. But here's what they said. You have more freedom to connect dodges and attacks with Zack. The original system, the combat system, was a little bit clunky. It almost felt like a turn-based RPG just because how much things were slow to react. Sounds like they're giving you a lot more powerful to control how you're battling bosses. There will be no new missions, but you can select hard mode from the beginning. Originally, you had to beat a mission and then play it separately again a second time on hard mode. So this is interesting. So no new missions means no added content, essentially. It means that they're not trying to add in like remixes or bonus dungeons or anything like that, which to me is a little bit disappointing. I did want to see something that was completely new. But here's the last thing. There will be no story changes to Crisis Core. So that means that the people that right now have been theorizing that at the end of the game, we were going to see Zack survive the battle that was supposed to kill him or something, I don't think that's on the table. I do think they are officially confirming the things that happened still happened. How they're going to... It seems like they're completely confirming. It seems like they are just completely confirming that the events that already took place, they've still taken place. It doesn't really make sense how we're going to have Zack alive then in Rebirth. They are going to have to definitely do some multiversal gobbledygook. Now, the very last tweet I wanted to look at was this short one that was just done about 30 minutes ago by the Final Fantasy VII Remake Twitter account, which is the fact that they're actually putting one of these urban legends to rest. For a long time, people were saying that the Crisis Core couldn't not come back, that Crisis Core couldn't be remastered, it couldn't be remade because Gact, the original voice actor, would not allow them to use his audio. Apparently, they're officially disproving that and saying they could have made it at any time. They were just waiting for the time to be right. All of this is interesting. I am glad that Square Enix is being so transparent to talk about why these games are going to be so big and cool, but I do not fully believe them when they say this isn't going to have some changes, some substantial changes. Just because the nature of Remake Part 1, seeing what they've done with Sephiroth already, I simply cannot believe that this is going to be as one-to-one as they're sort of portraying it. But what do you guys think? Are you excited for whatever the heck Rebirth is going to be? Are you excited to play the entirety of the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy? Tell me your thoughts in the comments down below. And additionally, please keep dreaming. And you know what? By the way, today is the 22nd anniversary of the release of Final Fantasy IX, which I still think is the best of the classic Final Fantasies. I like Final Fantasy VII more, but FF9, it's a bop, baby. Thanks for watching, guys. Keep dreaming. Thanks so much for watching that video. If you want to see something else, you can always click this link to see what I put up last, or, subscribe and see what's coming up next. Also, I promise that whatever I do, it'll try not to suck.